This is a video on linear functions and their graphs, and the goal in this video is to be able to graph linear functions and be able to write the rules for different linear functions that you see. So let's first of all define what a linear function is. So remember, a linear function is a rule that will create a straight line when you graph it in the coordinate plane. So our goal is to be able to write those rules and to be able to describe and to be able to graph those rules quickly and efficiently. So remember, the rule always is y equals mx plus b. That's the standard way to write the rule. And the m, remember, stands for the slope. We also remember that slope is a description of the rise over the run. And another math notation that you've seen your teacher use is delta y over delta x. Because remember, rise is how much y would change, and run would describe how much x would change. So we're looking at the graph and we're trying to describe the slope. And that's the number for m that we would see here. So for our example here, our m value is always with x, and it looks like there's only one x in our rule, so the slope is 1. Let's see how we can see that in the graph. The slope, remember, rise over run, so if I pick any 2 points that I can find on my graph, I should be able to rock from one to the other, and notice that I rise 2 and I run 2, so my rise over my run is 2 over 2, which is 1, just like the rule predicted. Now the next value that I want to find is b. So whenever I'm working with linear equations, linear functions, I'm going to look for b as well, and b stands for the y-intercept. Also remember that when you first started learning about writing rules, we often refer to that as the starting value. And that starting value always has to occur on the y-axis, which is why it's called the y-intercept. So we look to our line again and we find the y-axis is the vertical axis here, and we notice that it crosses the y-axis at 4. Once again, that number appears in my equation. I can see that 4 is my v value, and that's where I cross the y-axis. So that's a quick review of your rules and how they appear in the graph and what those numbers mean in the rule as well as the graph. So let's take a look at some problems that you're going to have to be able to solve in order to show that you understand this concept. So example 1, writing a rule from a graph. So remember, always remember your rule. Your general form of your rule is y equals mx plus b. Okay, so with that, I need to find the 2 numbers that will make this rule work. I need to find the m value and the b value. I have to find those by using the graph. So I always need to remember that m is the slope. And so if I'm trying to find the slope on the graph, I want to remember my many definitions that I can think of. That it's the delta y over delta x, or I can think of it as rise over run. So remember, you always just find any 2 points, and you find out what's the rise and what's the run. So I see a point here and a point here. And I'm going to walk from one point to the next. The good news is it doesn't matter which direction you walk first. What's important is how you put it into the fraction. So we notice that from one point on the left here to the right, it looks like we went down 1 and we went over 2. Well, whenever we go down, we want to consider it a negative. And I often like to work from left to right. Take a look at this line. Does it have a negative slope? So remember, negative slopes, the line should be going downwards. It's saying it's decreasing over time. And it is, in fact, going downwards from left to right. So my slope here is negative, and it's 1/2 because the rise was 1 and the run was 2. Don't forget, if you would have picked any 2 other points, you would still get the right slope. Even if you drew the slope triangle above, you would still get the right slope. In this case, we see it goes down 2 and it goes over 4. But negative 2/4 is equal to negative 1/2. It's the same slope. So it won't matter which points you pick in order to find the slope. What matters is that you carefully count what's the rise, and what's the run. So here we have my rules so far. I know m is 1/2, negative 1/2. Now I have to find b. So remember the definition of b in the rule is that it's the y-intercept. So I'm going to take a look back at my line. And I always want to remember that the y-axis is the vertical axis, and I see my y-intercept right there. So it looks like it's at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It looks like it's up at 7. So my rule is finished as y equals negative 1/2 x plus 7. So let's take a look at another example where it's kind of backwards. They're going to give us the rule, and we have to be able to graph it. Okay, so always remembering your y equals mx plus b in order to make your graphs. Let's take a look at the next example. We're trying to make a graph from this rule. So we always want to remember what these numbers stand for. Remember, the number with x, multiplying x, is always your slope. And the number being added or subtracted off is your b value or your y-intercept. So it looks like our slope equals 2, and our y-intercept, or if remember, that means our starting value is equal to negative 3. So negative 3 is where I'm going to start, but remember it's always starting on the y-axis, so I'm going to start down at 3. And that's how I'm going to use the b value in my rule. Now I have to use a slope. Now slope, remember, is rise over run, but since we only have one number, we have to think carefully, what's the rise and what's the run? There's not a fraction here. So remember, to turn any number into fraction, you simply put it over 1, because 2 divided by 1 is equal to 2. It's the same number. So I'm going to use the slope of 2 to help me graph more points on my line. I'm going to walk the slope. So I'm starting at negative 3, and I'm going to rise 2, 1, 2. I'm rising 2, and I'm going to go over 1. And that's where I'm going to be for my next point. Now I'm going to do it again. I'm going to keep rising 2, 1, 2, and going over 1. There's my next point. Okay, I'm going to keep doing that until I get as many points as I want to make a complete graph. Rise 2, run 1. Now I can see a nice straight line for me. Connect my points, draw an arrow. Okay. So what's important is that we knew to start at negative 3 here because of the b value, and then we use the slope, but we had to change it into a fraction like we did here in order to find the rise and the run. Okay, let's try one more problem like this, and then you'll try some on your own. Let's take a look at example 3. So one more, making a graph from a rule. It looks like negative 3/4 x plus 3. So remember, the 3 is your start, or your b value. That's where I'm going to start my graph, up at 3. That's my y-intercept. Remember, y is your vertical axis. Negative 3/4, that's my slope. So that's my rise over my run, or delta y over delta x. So I'm going to go from this point, I'm going to go down 3, 1, head down 3, over 4, and that's where I'm going to plot my next point. Let's do it again. I'm going to go down 3, over 4. And that's where I'm going to plot my next point. So these points, a couple of key questions that students tend to have or make mistakes on is understanding why we go down 3 but then we go forwards 4. And the big key here is if we take a look at this line, first of all, we can see that it's going downwards just like it's supposed to because of the negative 3/4. So that's one way I know that I'm right. Another reason is the rise and the run are always going to be the ones that you want to change. The rise is always going to be the one you want to change. So from this point, if it would have been positive, I would have started by rising upwards, but it was negative, so I started by falling downwards and going forwards 4. We always want to go forwards in time. That's how I always want to think of it when we're running across the graph. Okay, another reason why is if I made both the numbers negative and I went down 3 and then backwards 4, I would have negative 3 over negative 4, but if we remember our rules from integer operations, that would equal the same thing as positive 3/4. But I don't want positive 3/4, I want negative 3/4 because that was the rule. So that's another reason why it's a good idea to always rise in the direction of your slope, so up or down according to a positive or negative, and then use the run. The run will always be positive. It's a simple way to always keep it straight. Okay, but always take a look at your line, make sure it looks right. It's going downwards and it starts at the right spot, so it seems like you made it, that the graph is correct. So now it's your turn to try some. Definitely rewind this video and see some more, or ask your teacher for some help, but you will be tested on these problems to make sure you understand them. So your goal for these 4 questions is to write the rule. Okay? Carefully find those points, and always remember the form of the rule that you want to use is y equals mx plus b. Okay? The next 4 questions ask you to graph them. So use the graph paper provided. If you need more space and it's hard to put all 4 lines in the same graph, feel free to get more graph paper. Ask your teacher for help if you need it. But make sure you understand this, ask more questions, and ask for more help if you get stuck.